Late November 1944, the sky over the Belgian-German border is the color of wet iron. Inside the unheated cockpit of a canvas-skinned L-4 Grasshopper, shatter the stretched American lines and trigger a devastating, mobile bloodbath. The observer urgently radios the grid coordinates back to headquarters. To feed the surviving heavy tanks, German logistical officers were reduced to rolling 50-gallon fuel drums down logging roads by hand, or dragging them through the snow on horse-drawn wooden carts. The mathematics of modern mechanized movement had completely collapsed. The Allied observers counting tanks from the air could not see this severed tail. They saw intact turrets, thick armor plates, and long-barreled guns. They did not realize that the monsters below them were functioning on borrowed time. A tank without a recovery vehicle and a fuel truck is no longer a weapon of mobile exploitation. It is a single-use asset. The question was no longer whether the elite armor could survive an Allied barrage. The question was, what would happen to these carefully preserved machines the moment they were ordered to actually maneuver into battle? Inside a concrete command bunker, illuminated by the harsh glow of carbide lamps, a German staff officer drags a grease pencil across a topographical map. He draws a bold circle around a crossroads, linking together the shattered remnants of once proud units. He pulls 6 surviving Panthers from a decimated Panzer division, pairs them with 4 Tigers from an independent heavy battalion, and attaches a localized company of infantry. He labels the circle with the name of its commanding officer. This is a Kampfgruppe, an ad hoc battle group. In the early years of the war, the Kampfgruppe was the ultimate symbol of German tactical genius. The Allied infantry dig their foxholes deeper, uncrate their anti-tank ammunition, and brace for the inevitable hammer blow. But the blow never arrives. It was a temporary, highly lethal combination of armor, artillery, and motorized infantry, custom-built to exploit a fleeting battlefield opportunity. But in the freezing twilight of 1944, the Kampfgruppe was no longer a tool of flexibility. It was a mechanism of triage. Commanders were sweeping the debris of ruined divisions together, trying to forge a single, concentrated spear tip out of their carefully preserved heavy armor. On paper and on the intelligence maps analyzed by Allied forces, these battle groups projected immense power. The presence of even a dozen concentrated heavy tanks created a psychological shockwave. Allied commanders read the reconnaissance reports of Tigers and Panthers massing under veteran officers, and they prepared for a deep, coordinated armored breakthrough. The Kampfgruppe preserved the illusion that the German army could still wage a war of rapid, mechanized maneuver. But a battle group built through cannibalization is not a true armored formation. It is a hollow shell. A fully functioning armored division operates as a balanced ecosystem. It relies on light reconnaissance vehicles to probe enemy weak points, self-propelled artillery to suppress anti-tank guns, and motorized infantry to protect the tank's vulnerable flanks in dense terrain. The late-war Kampfgruppe lacked this critical connective tissue. To preserve fuel and spare parts for the heavy tanks, the motorized infantry had often been forced to abandon their trucks. When the German offensive finally begins, the terrifying concentration of heavy armor does not slice through the American defenses. It does not maneuver. The supporting artillery had broken down and been left behind. The heavy tanks were suddenly thrust forward as solitary predators, blind and unprotected. The veteran commanders tasked with leading these battle groups understood the extreme danger. They were being asked to drive 68-ton machines into hostile territory, without the infantry screens necessary to keep Allied soldiers with bazookas at bay. Yet, the High Command's orders were absolute. The tanks had been preserved for this exact moment. They had to attack, to compensate for the logistical rot beneath them. The German commanders banked everything on momentum and shock value. They believed that the sheer terror of concentrated heavy armor would shatter the American lines. Before their own fragile battle groups could fracture, the operational plan became entirely predatory because they had no fuel trucks or supply lines of their own. The Kampfgruppe was often ordered to smash through the front and capture American supply depots. They would have to feed the heavy tanks with captured gasoline, or they would stop dead in their tracks. It was a doctrine built entirely on desperation and the perceived invulnerability of the heavy tank. But it rested on a fatal assumption. It assumed that the tanks could actually physically reach the American lines to break them. The illusion of the Kampfgruppe looked flawless on the grease-penciled maps in the bunker, but the maps did not show the mud, the narrow logging trails, flank or overrun the frontline battalions. Instead, the attack fractures almost the moment it crosses the line of departure. The elite panzer unit, or the freezing reality of a forest road. Could the tactical brilliance of the crews overcome the mechanical decay consuming their machines? The order to advance finally arrives in the freezing dark. A concentrated column of heavy armor grinds out of the tree line. The lead vehicle is a Tiger, weighing nearly 70 tons. Its broad steel tracks churning the soft forest road into a slurry of mud and crushed ice. Behind it rolls a tight procession of Panthers and armored half-tracks, engines roaring, exhausts glowing dull red in the winter night. This is the moment the High Command has sacrificed so much to achieve. The elite spearhead is moving. But before they even cross the American lines, the physical reality of the battlefield intervenes. 2 miles down a narrow logging trail, the ground gives way beneath the immense weight of the lead Tiger. The tank slides sideways. The right track digs deeply into a frozen embankment, strains against the icy mud, and violently snaps. The heavy steel pins shear off with a sharp metallic crack. The massive track unfurls into the ditch. The driver immediately cuts the ignition, plunging the surrounding forest into a sudden, tense silence. In earlier years, this would be a minor tactical delay, but tonight it is a fatal hemorrhage. The road is flanked by dense pine trees and steep, wooded ravines, simply dissolves in the snow. Days later, when American infantry tentatively advance to secure the contested ground, they walk into a graveyard of heavy armor. There is no room for the following Panthers to bypass the disabled Tiger. The entire column halts. The tank commander urgently radios for a heavy recovery vehicle to clear the path. The radio operator receives the grim reply from the rear echelons. There are no recovery vehicles available. The only way to move the 70-ton obstruction is to drag it out with 2 other Tigers. But there is no room to maneuver them into position, and the commanders cannot spare the fuel for the attempt. As the column sits trapped on the narrow trail, the secondary crisis begins. The temperatures are plunging rapidly. To keep the heavy engine blocks from freezing and cracking, the crews of the trailing tanks must keep their Maybach engines idling. Every minute they sit stationary behind the broken Tiger, they are burning the irreplaceable synthetic fuel they desperately need for the offensive. The fuel gauges slowly drop. The carefully hoarded gasoline, stolen from infantry supply trucks and carried by hand in 50-gallon drums, is turning into useless grey smoke drifting up into the pine canopy. Within 3 hours, the elite armored strike force is effectively paralyzed. They have not taken a single hit from an American anti-tank gun. They have not been strafed by Allied aircraft. But it is not a graveyard created by American artillery. The infantrymen carefully walk past 68-ton Tigers and 45-ton Panthers, sitting dead, yet the offensive is functionally dead. The friction of movement has shattered the spearhead. The lead tank cannot be repaired. Because the replacement track links were never shipped. It cannot be pushed aside because the towing half-tracks were left behind. And the rest of the battle group cannot fight because their fuel tanks are running dry just trying to keep the crews from freezing to death. The commanders in the concrete bunkers slowly realized that their heavily armored fire brigade cannot reach the fire. The heavy tanks are physically incapable of maneuvering through the contested zones, but the vehicles themselves are still intact. The main guns still function. The thick frontal armor remains unpierced. If the machinery of movement had failed completely, the German military had to find a desperate use for the lethal steel that remained. What does an army do with a 68-ton combat vehicle when it can no longer move forward or retreat? A crossroad in a ruined Belgian village. A 45-ton Panther sits motionless, its fuel tanks completely dry. The engine is dead. The driver is no longer a driver. He is a laborer holding a shovel. The crew is piling frozen earth, cobblestones, and shattered timber against the lower hull, and silent on the narrow, rutted logging roads. The heavy steel hatches are thrown open. The massive gun barrels are completely undamaged. Burying the tracks and the fragile lower steel plates, they are entrenching the vehicle. This was the final, desperate tactical devolution of the German heavy armor. When the fuel finally ran out, or a minor mechanical failure permanently froze the tracks, the High Command issued a bleak directive. The tanks were not to be abandoned. They were to be transformed into static steel fortresses. The doctrine of sweeping armored maneuver, the foundational principle that had defined the German military for years, was officially dead. The ultimate mobile weapon had been reduced to a pillbox. Defensively, a dug-in heavy tank was a nightmare for advancing Allied infantry. Positioned carefully at a choke point, a bridge, a narrow valley, or a ruined street, a static Panther was incredibly lethal. Its high-velocity 75mm gun could still destroy any approaching American or British vehicle long before they could close the distance. With its vulnerable lower hull buried beneath debris, only the thick, sloped frontal armor and the heavily armored turret were exposed. To dislodge it, Allied forces often had to bleed heavily, calling in massive artillery strikes or launching dangerous infantry flanking maneuvers. But this localized defensive lethality masked a complete operational failure. A tank that cannot move is no longer a tank. It is an artillery piece with a severely limited field of fire. The moment the engine died, the machine began to degrade from the inside out. The complex, overlapping road wheels are intact, and the thick, sloped frontal armor plates show no blackened scorch marks or jagged penetration holes. Without engine power, the crew could no longer use hydraulics to quickly rotate the heavy turret to track moving targets. They had to crank the massive gun around by hand, a slow and exhausting process. The batteries, unable to be charged by the engine's alternator, quickly drained, killing the internal radios and plunging the crew compartment into silence and darkness. More importantly, a static tank cannot retreat. When Allied infantry inevitably outflanked the crossroad, or when the heavy guns simply ran out of high explosive and armor-piercing shells, the veteran crew had no means of escape. The very armor the High Command had sacrificed the Army's logistical tail to preserve had become an immovable steel trap. The crew was forced to fight until their ammunition was exhausted and then flee on foot. Yet, from the outside, the illusion of German armored strength held remarkably firm. An American Sherman turning a corner and taking a high-velocity shell through its front plate did not know or care that the enemy Panther firing it was out of fuel, missing a transmission, and completely incapable of reversing. The kinetic result on the battlefield was exactly the same. This terrifying localized lethality created a powerful distortion on the Allied situation maps. When reconnaissance flights spotted heavy gun barrels protruding from the rubble, and frontline reports described devastating fire from heavy armor, The intelligence officers assumed they were fighting a fully functional panzer force from Allied shells. These machines were not destroyed in a firefight, they were simply abandoned. This was the impossible contradiction of the late war. They could measure the thickness of the enemy armor and the caliber of the guns. But why did they continually overestimate the operational capacity of the German army, remaining totally blind to the mechanical rot consuming the machines from the inside? Inside a canvas intelligence tent behind the front line, an American photo interpreter hunches over a folding table. He adjusts a stereoscopic viewer over a pair of black and white aerial reconnaissance photographs. Through the lenses, the shadows in a distant Belgian tree line become three-dimensional. The long, overhanging gun barrel, the distinct, boxy engine deck. The interpreter makes a grease pencil mark on the acetate overlay. He has identified another Tiger. The intelligence officer beside him updates the divisional threat board. To the men in this tent, counting enemy hulls is the mathematics of survival. The Allied military apparatus was highly competent, but it suffered from a fundamental blind spot. It projected its own reality onto the enemy. When an American or British intelligence officer saw a tank on a map, they saw the tip of a massive, healthy spear. In the Allied system, a Sherman rolling into a French village was supported by an invisible, unbroken chain stretching all the way back to the factories of Detroit. If an American tank threw a track, a heavy recovery vehicle arrived to pull it out. German armored force. To the Allied officers analyzing the aerial photographs, the enemy appeared lethally potent. The tanks were structurally perfect. If it ran low on fuel, a convoy of 2.5-ton trucks materialized with thousands of jerrycans. In the Allied doctrine, a tank was just the kinetic delivery system for an overwhelming logistical empire. Because their own armored units were organically linked to mobile workshops, replacement depots, and infinite gasoline, they logically assumed the elite German formations operating across the front line possessed the same circulatory system. They were measuring the wrong metrics of power. Allied intelligence officers obsessively analyzed the thickness of German frontal armor plates and the muzzle velocity of the 88mm gun. These were terrifying, measurable facts. But cameras mounted in the bellies of high-altitude reconnaissance planes could not photograph empty fuel tanks. They could not capture the panicked radio calls of a German commander begging for a replacement transmission that did not exist. They could not see the missing towing half-tracks that had been burned into scrap metal weeks earlier. The Allied analysts could only see the surviving steel. They could not see the mechanical rot consuming it. When British or American generals received reports of a concentrated German heavy panzer battalion, their operational calculations told them this force could strike 30 miles. An American artillery observer peers through his binoculars, fighting the constant vibration of a 65-horsepower engine. Down in the freezing mud of a pine forest, the weapons systems were fully operational. The crews inside them were seasoned, highly trained, and dangerous. By every visible metric of military power, deep into their lines. They positioned anti-tank reserves and altered entire divisional movements to counter a war of rapid maneuver. They had no way of knowing that the terrifying column of 68-ton monsters on their maps possessed only enough stolen fuel to advance 3 miles before stopping forever. The illusion held because the localized violence was real. When an American infantry company encountered a dug-in panther at a muddy crossroads, the high-velocity shells tearing through their positions were lethal. The localized trauma confirmed the intelligence reports. The enemy armor was still deadly, but the Allied frontline soldiers were fighting an amputated hand that could still grip a throat, completely unaware that the body attached to it had already bled to death. The opposing forces were fighting two different wars. The Allies were fighting a war of massive industrial systems. The German commanders, trapped by the demands of their superiors, were fighting a war of individual, stranded machines. The thick armor had blinded both sides to the truth of what a combat vehicle actually requires to exist. But if a tank is no longer part of a logistical network and merely a disconnected bunker waiting to run out of ammunition, what finally determines the true endpoint of its lifespan? The German battalion was at fighting strength, yet it had suffered a total operational collapse without ever engaging the enemy in a sustained armored battle. When the American infantrymen finally walked cautiously through the snow-dusted pine forests spotted by the artillery observer days earlier, they find the graveyard exactly as it was left. The 68-ton Tigers and 45-ton Panthers sit silently on the narrow, rutted logging trails. To the frontline soldier, the mystery of these pristine, abandoned machines feels eerie, almost supernatural. The overlapping road wheels are unblemished. The sloped frontal plates carry no jagged scars from anti-tank shells. The heavy hatches are simply thrown wide open to the freezing winter air. The question was never really about the thickness of the German steel, the velocity of the 88mm gun, or the pedigree of the elite units. It was about the invisible machinery of survival. The German High Command had believed that combat power resided in the physical hull of the tank itself. They had sacrificed the trucks, the recovery half-tracks, and the fuel lines to keep these massive steel predators alive on paper. But a tank without a supply chain is not a weapon of war. It is an iron tomb waiting to stop moving. By severing the logistical tail to preserve the spearhead, the military command had created an illusion that terrifyingly deceived both themselves and their enemies. But the illusion ended the moment the ignition was cut. The men who actually lived inside these machines understood the truth. The American commanders initially assumed their own harassing artillery barrages or weather-delayed air power had somehow broken the attack. But the silent, pristine hulls long before the generals in the concrete bunkers did. In the final hours, before those heavy steel hatches were pushed open, there was no dramatic final stand against an overwhelming Allied onslaught. There was only the harsh, sputtering cough of a massive Maybach engine running out of its final drops of stolen, scavenged fuel. There was the sudden, heavy silence inside the turret as the generator died and the radio went dark. The veteran crews, men who had survived years of mechanized slaughter on the Eastern Front, knew exactly what that silence meant. No heavy prime movers were coming to tow them out of the mud. No supply trucks were navigating the dark roads behind them, with drums of synthetic gasoline. The system that had built their machines, trained them, and supplied them had already collapsed. The armor had survived the war, but the war had left the armor behind. In the end, the carefully preserved heavy battalions were not destroyed by enemy fire. They were dismantled by the men who had exhausted themselves trying to keep them alive. Often lacking the heavy explosives required to scuttle the thick hulls, the crews simply spiked the guns. They smashed the finely machined optical sights with hammers. They unbolted the heavy breech blocks and hurled them deep into the freezing mud. They rendered the ultimate weapons of the German army completely inert from the inside out. Left on the logging roads, told a deeply unsettling story. The machines had not been beaten by superior Allied firepower. They had been killed, leaving the exterior perfectly, deceivingly intact for the Allied troops to find. The real cost of this collapsed system was paid by the unglamorous men in the background, the shivering mechanics whose frostbitten, grease-stained hands had cannibalized 3 broken Panthers in the dark just to get one transmission working. The drivers who had expertly navigated 70 tons of steel through icy ravines without a drop of spare oil. The logistical clerks who had forcibly siphoned fuel from ambulances just to feed a heavy tank that would ultimately drive only 3 miles before freezing permanently to the ground. They had performed miracles of salvage to keep the heavy armor alive for one final offensive. But steel cannot eat miracles. When the fuel gauges hit zero, the most lethal, highly engineered armored vehicles in the world were reduced to static landmarks. The veteran crews climbed out of their pristine machines, dropped down into the snow, and joined the retreating infantry to walk back to Germany on foot, from the inside out. To understand why a fully equipped, elite armored spearhead suffocated before it could fire a shot in anger, we have to look past the thickness of the armor plates. We must look at the desperate calculations of the German commanders who sent them forward, and why they believed they could fight a war of movement after the machinery of movement had already died. By late 1944, the war for the German High Command had devolved into an exercise in terrifying mathematics. On massive situation maps in concrete bunkers, staff officers pushed unit markers across the table, watching the Soviet army devour infantry divisions in the east, while the Western Allies crushed the borders of the Reich under absolute material superiority. The German military was bleeding out. Partially hidden by layers of cut branches and camouflage netting, he spots the unmistakable, blocky shapes of German heavy armor, Panthers and Tiger tanks. They could no longer match the sheer volume of American Shermans or Soviet T-34s rolling off untouched assembly lines. The solution to this numerical nightmare was the heavy tank. The Panther and the Tiger were designed not just as weapons, but as force multipliers. In the minds of the men directing the war, a single heavy panzer battalion possessed the kinetic energy to halt an entire enemy division. They became the ultimate strategic asset. This belief birthed a new, desperate doctrine. The elite heavy armor was frequently decoupled from standard infantry or mechanized units. Instead, they were designated as fire brigades. They were held in reserve by high-level commanders, sitting on trains or parked in rear assembly areas, waiting for the front line to fracture. When a crisis erupted, the heavy battalions were rushed to the breach to violently plug the gap, only to be immediately withdrawn and hurled toward the next disaster. But this reliance created a crushing pressure on the men tasked with commanding them. To lose a rifle company was an expected tragedy. To lose a 68-ton Tiger was a catastrophe that required a formal explanation. To the highest levels of command, a battalion commander's competence was no longer judged by the territory he captured, but by the daily operational readiness reports he wired back to headquarters. The mandate was clear and unforgiving: preserve the heavy armor at all costs. He tracks them through the glass and counts. 10, 20. A concentrated mass of nearly 40 heavy combat vehicles idling deep in the tree line. The chassis must survive. On paper, the strategy appeared logically sound. Prioritize the most lethal weapons, keep them concentrated, and shield them from meaningless attrition. But warfare is not waged on paper. A heavy tank is an instrument of extreme violence, but it is also an instrument of profound mechanical fragility. The immense weight of a Tiger or a Panther placed devastating stress on its engine block, its transmission, and its complex overlapping road wheels. Every mile driven outside of combat degraded the vehicle. They required an endless river of synthetic fuel, specialized lubricants, and highly machined replacement parts, just to reach the battlefield. In the early years of the war, this voracious appetite was fed by a dedicated, motorized logistical tail. Supply trucks, recovery half-tracks, and mobile workshops followed the armor like a shadow. But by the winter of 1944, the Allied strategic bombing campaign had obliterated the rail networks. The factories producing spare parts were buried under rubble. The fuel trucks were burning on the side of the roads, strafed into scrap by roaming Allied fighter bombers. The official supply chain had been severed. Yet, The High Command still demanded that the heavy battalions report for combat duty. The tanks were ordered to move, to fight, and to survive, regardless of the collapsed infrastructure around them. For the frontline mechanics, logistical officers, and tank commanders huddled in the freezing forests, thick exhaust plumes drift up through the pine needles, grey against the early morning frost. To an Allied observer in the winter of 1944, the mandate to preserve the elite armor collided violently with the reality of empty supply depots. They could not magically summon a replacement transmission for a stranded Panther, but the tank had to run. The daily readiness report had to be filed. If the industrial system from above could no longer feed the machines, the units on the ground would have to find a way to feed themselves. To keep the fire brigades alive, they turned to a method that would slowly eat their own army alive. Deep inside a snow-dusted pine forest, beneath a canopy of heavy tarpaulins, a German maintenance crew works by the dim blue light of shielded lanterns. The temperature is well below freezing. The mechanic's hands are cracked with grease and frostbite. Suspended on heavy jacks above the frozen mud sits a 45-ton Panther. Its massive Maybach engine block has been hoisted out, exposing the complex, fractured teeth of a shattered transmission. The tank is functionally dead. The maintenance officer checks his manifest. There are no replacement transmissions in the depot. The nearest railhead, which might have held parts, was obliterated by Allied bombers 3 days ago, but the battalion commander's order remains absolute. The tank must be operational by dawn. The daily readiness report sent to the High Command cannot show another vehicle lost to mechanical failure. A formation like this meant one specific thing. This was an elite heavy panzer battalion. It represented thousands of tons of hardened steel. If the industrial supply chain could not deliver parts, the mechanics had to harvest them. 2 miles down a rutted logging road sits another Panther. 2 days earlier, it slipped off a muddy embankment and through its right track, damaging its drive sprocket. Under normal conditions, this is a routine recovery. A heavy towing vehicle would pull the tank out, the track would be pinned back together, and the machine would return to the line. But there are no tow vehicles available. The order is given. The mechanics descend on the stranded Panther like vultures on a fresh kill. They do not just take the transmission, they strip the tank bare. They unbolt the finely machined optical sights. They drain the hydraulic fluid. They rip out the radio sets, the generator, and the engine belts. Within hours, a perfectly sound combat vehicle, one that required thousands of industrial hours and tons of raw material to construct, is permanently reduced to an empty iron carcass. In German military terminology, the tank was cannibalized. This was the hidden mechanism keeping the elite heavy battalions alive. It was a triage of desperation. To keep one pristine tank on the morning readiness report, 2 or 3 other slightly damaged vehicles were deliberately destroyed by their own crews. The elite units were eating themselves to survive, and the parasitism did not stop at spare parts. Manned by decorated veterans who had survived the brutal mechanized attrition of the Eastern Front. They were equipped with high-velocity 88mm guns. A heavy tank consumed gallons of synthetic fuel just to idle its engine and turn its massive turret. As the fuel pipelines dried up, local commanders began enforcing a ruthless priority system. To fill the bellies of the heavy armor, logistical officers forcibly siphoned gasoline from infantry supply trucks, artillery transports, and ambulance half-tracks. The heavy battalions survived by paralyzing the rest of the army. When the morning status reports reached the concrete bunkers of the High Command, the numbers looked reassuring. The charts showed a concentrated, combat-ready armored spearhead. The generals saw a lethal fire brigade, primed and ready to strike. They did not see the hollowed-out shells rusting in the ditches. They did not see the infantry units trapped on foot because their transport trucks had been drained dry to feed the elite tanks. The system had successfully preserved the illusion of combat power. The guns were loaded, and the engines were stitched together with stolen organs. It was enough to look terrifying while parked in a camouflaged assembly area. But armored warfare relies on momentum. The ultimate test of a tank is not whether it can run in a workshop, but whether it can cross brutal terrain under fire. When the High Command finally ordered this fragile, scavenged fleet to advance, the true cost of their survival would become immediately clear. Capable of punching through an American Sherman tank from over a mile away. According to every established doctrine of military intelligence, the fatal flaw lay not just in the tanks themselves, but in the critical, unglamorous machines that were no longer there to save them. A 68-ton Tiger tank sinking into soft Belgian mud is not a rare combat anomaly. It is the predictable cost of moving a machine, the weight of a locomotive across unpaved winter terrain. When the heavy tracks snap or the road wheels jam with frozen mud, the tank becomes an immovable steel bunker. But the veteran crew inside is not initially panicked. They know the doctrine. They simply shut down the engine, button the hatches, and wait for the recovery echelon. In earlier years, the sound of salvation would arrive quickly. It took 2 or 3 massive 18-ton prime movers, chained together in a roaring tandem, to drag a bogged Tiger back to solid ground. Later, the German military deployed the Panther, a dedicated heavy recovery vehicle built on a Panther tank chassis, equipped with a heavy-duty winch and a powerful engine. These were the unglamorous workhorses of the armored division. They were the safety net that allowed commanders to push their tanks into hostile territory, knowing that a mechanical failure would not cost them the vehicle. But as the winter of 1944 set in, the crews waiting in the freezing mud listened for the roar of the recovery engines and heard only the wind. The safety net had quietly gone extinct. The heavy recovery vehicles were large, slow, and almost entirely unarmed. A concentration of this magnitude was not defensive. It was a coiled spring. Within hours, these machines were expected to grind forward. To the Allied fighter bombers that owned the daytime skies, a towing half-track was a highly visible, undefended target. Hundreds were strafed and burned on the roads of France and Western Europe. But the fatal blow came from within the German system itself. Recovery vehicles drank enormous quantities of synthetic fuel. When battalion commanders began ruthlessly siphoning gasoline to keep their fighting tanks alive, the recovery vehicles were the first to be drained, parked, and left behind. The German command had preserved the spear tip, but they had deliberately severed the shaft. The consequence of this amputation was absolute. A thrown track in 1942 was a 3-hour delay. A thrown track in late 1944 was a permanent kill. A perfectly intact heavy tank that simply slipped off an icy road into a shallow ditch was a tank lost to the war forever. This paralysis extended directly to the fuel distribution network. A single Tiger consumed roughly 2 gallons of fuel for every mile driven cross-country. Moving an entire heavy battalion just 20 miles from a staging area to a line of departure required thousands of gallons. The doctrine assumed this fuel would be delivered by fleets of motorized supply trucks moving directly behind the armored wedge. But those trucks were gone. They had been destroyed, broken down, or cannibalized for parts.